What up, nerds? My name is Leslie Smith. Welcome back to the Nerdy Narrative. I'm so excited to bring you another video today in my author series, Why My Story Matters. I created this series for readers who are like me, readers who read a story or a series and they wonder, what was it about this story that inspired the author to write it? I love to know the author's intentions, and sometimes there are none. It's always hilarious when in conversation with an author, I'm like, how did you come up with this story? And they're like, I just did. But in most cases, there is a reason behind it. So the goal of this series is to introduce you to something I read that I enjoyed that I thought you might would like too. Also introduce you to the author and hear what their intent was behind the story. And then finally, a reading from the author where they read either a quote, a passage, something from the story that captures the intent behind the story. Today's guest is Stephen Aryan, and we're going to be talking about his duology, Quest for Heroes. Stephen Aryan's introduction to fantasy came at a very young age, reading authors such as David Eddings, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, also Tracy Hickman, Terry Brooks, Ursula Le Guin, and probably the most influential to this list is David Gemmell. Stephen Aryan graduated university in 1999, which is when he began submitting his novels to agents. In 2013, his latest novel, Battle Mage, was submitted to agent Juliet Mushins. The rest, they say, is history because in 2014, Orbit Books snatched up Battle Mage. They published it in 2015 and rounded it all out by publishing the other two books in that trilogy in 2016. The success of the Age of Darkness trilogy led to Orbit Books publishing the Age of Dread trilogy between 2017 and 2019. In 2018, Stephen Aryan also published a novella of Gods and Men with Orbit Books, which is a prequel to the Battle Mage trilogy. In 2021, Angry Robot Books published the first book in the Quest for Heroes duology, The Coward, and then today marks the day for Stephen Aryan's 8th book to be traditionally published, the sequel and finale of the Quest for Heroes duology with The Warrior. The Quest for Heroes duology is the focus of today's video, and just to give you a brief, non-spoiler summary of what these books are about. To put it simply, it is the life of a man named Kel Cressia. We first meet Kel in The Coward 10 years after he has saved the Five Kingdoms. Once again, the king has called on Kel to return to the frozen north and investigate what is happening there. The ice and snow has started to encroach on the south again, and there is the fear that the ice lich has returned, or if not, something else has taken over. And the king feels there is no one else suited for the job but the previous hero who beheaded the ice lich 10 years prior. And then as we move into the sequel, The Warrior, when we reunite with Kel, we find him absolutely miserable. He has everything: fame, power, money, a family, everything he could possibly want. So when an old friend shows up to cash in on a favor, he jumps at the opportunity to repay this favor with his friend and leave everything behind. In the course of this story, our characters come in contact with something called the Malice, and it's absolutely terrifying. If you remember watching The Neverending Story as a kid and you remember how terrified the characters were of the Nothing, that's the kind of feeling I got anytime I read about the Malice in this book. It was just absolutely terrifying for more reasons than one. I won't tell you because they would be spoilers. And so now that you're armed with the bare bones of what the Quest for Heroes is about, let's hear from the author himself as he explains what inspired him to write this story. Hi, Stephen. Welcome to the Nerdy Narrative. Thank you so much for coming on here today to talk to us about the Quest for Heroes and why this story matters to you. And so we'll just start with that question. What was it about this story? Was it a character? Was it an event? Was it a feeling, an emotion, something inspired? What was it about this particular story that had you spilling these words onto the pages?
Normally, the worst question you could ask a writer is, where'd you get your ideas? However, with this particular one, I know the answer very, very specifically because it all comes down to the character of Kel. He was what I was focusing on for the first book in particular, and then for the second book. But it goes back a few years. Like everything else, it started with fiction and the news and just everything. I was soaking all these different things up. So a few people have said, have I been in the armed forces? And I have not, but some members of my family have. They've served in the Navy and the Royal Air Force. And then I'm old enough that I've lived through a lot of wars on TV, whether, you know, the Gulf War or Afghanistan, and I've seen all these kind of things. And that was swirling around my brain. And then I started watching, it started with fiction. You've seen fictional TV shows and comics with people who've come back from war. And then from there, I started reading nonfiction. So I read some biographies of soldiers who come back from war. There's an American soldier called Noah Galloway, who was in the Gulf War, who came back and he was injured, but then he went on to become a motivational speaker, and he was on the cover of Men's Health, and he was on Dancing with the Stars and things. And this was a guy that suffered a massive injury from an IED, and he's lost one of his arms and part of his leg. And then I read another non-fiction biography about a journalist who spent 10 years in the Balkan states reporting on these terrible events and bringing the news to us, and how he ended up suffering with PTSD after being there for a decade. So all of this was going around in my brain, and I started thinking about the heroes that we see on TV, whether it's celebrities, whether it's, you know, movie stars or sports stars. And I thought there's the idea of the fiction and then the reality of the person. And then you have a fantasy character who goes off and does all these great things, but surely there's going to be a cost. Surely there has to be some kind of human cost on this person. And all of that kind of crystallized into the idea of Kel, of this person who's done this great thing 10 years in the past. And the story begins with him in the present, looking back on it, trying to escape the demons of his past, where everyone else has this version of reality. They think they know him. There's the story that's sung about him, but basically it's a kind of form of propaganda. It's a celebration of all the best moments that skirts over all of the bad things that happened to him and everybody else. So all of this was kind of going in my brain, and then I started working out the story, but it all began with Kel, of what is the true cost of being a hero within a fantasy world.
Which was such a refreshing take. I have thought and thought, trying to think of another, and I've got shelves, bookcases of fantasy, and I can't think of another one that had the character suffer the consequences of their actions. If you watch a lot of if you read a lot of reviews, you watch a lot of reviews on BookTube, you always hear the reviewer talk about, I love that magic had a cost.
Yeah.
But they never once say, I love that the warrior suffered from the actions, the things that he was sent to do. They have consequences. And I love when authors like you draw my attention to it, because until I met the character of Kel Cressia, I never once stopped to think, when I was reading these books, gosh, this knight had to go and do all of these things. What must that have done to him internally? And of course, you never see them suffer in the books either. And so I love that you started after Kel has been on this journey with these heroes.
Yeah.
And we're with him in his suffering. And I will admit, it took me halfway through the book to understand what that character work, that development, what was actually going on, because I was caught up with the quest and what he was currently doing with the king and everything. And then all of a sudden there was a conversation where I realized, hey, now wait a minute. And I remember, I'm one of those weirdos that I go through and I read acknowledgments and dedications and all of that. Yep. And I remembered your dedication at the front, and it stuck out to me because I'm a military brat. My dad's a retired brigadier general. And I was like, I see what's going on here. And I just, it just completely, you know, those moments on TV where the character like has this realization of what's going on, and it cuts to the screen of like something like blowing up. Like, that's what happened for me. And it just changed. It changed everything. It changed my perspective. It changed the way that I was interpreting the actions of the characters going forward. And it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful.
I'm glad it clicked. And finally, coalesced in your brain. I'm glad that you got it.
I sometimes it takes me a minute to get there, but I come around eventually. I mean, I am from Mississippi. We're very slow. Southerners typically take the slow way around, and we usually go the back way. So, what I would like for you to do now, if you're up for it, I typically will ask if there is something, a passage, a line, a quote from the story that you feel really just captures the essence of the story or the character of Kale that you would like to read for us.
Yeah. So there's two things. The first thing is the very first line, which
The
in
best.
some ways
Look, I have a list started for at the end of the year of my favorite first lines. This one is on it. It's at the top of the list.
Brilliant. We were saying, so I wrote this line and it never changed because it encapsulates the story, the character, the cost, the humor, the tragedy, and it's all kind of rolled into one. So I'll read the first line, and then there's a passage that also kind of summarizes part of what the story is about. So the first ever line of chapter 1 is: Kel Cressia, slayer of the ice lich and savior of the 5 kingdoms, tripped on a rake and fell into a pile of horse shit. So it's comedy. He's a hero. He's done great things. He's human, and yet he ultimately fell into a pile of horse shit, which is the awful suffering of what happened. But it's all a case of
it's like human. The gunslinger from the Dark Tower. You got to read it first because it's first. But once you reach the end, you should really go back and read that line again, knowing the full scope of the story. Read that line again and see how it just completely changes your perspective.
And this is only a short chapter, a couple of pages from chapter 1, that also summarizes part of the feeling that people have when they look at Kel and what they think of him and the perception and all this kind of stuff. So I'll read this bit. Can I join you for a drink? Asked Nadia. I'll pay, of course, she volunteered. Kel shook his head despite the offer of a free drink. It was always the same. They asked the same questions without fail. What did the ice lich look like? Did you really cut off a head with one blow? What happened to the heroes? And are their bodies really still up there on the ice? To them, it was nothing more than an exciting story. But he'd lived through the events in the Bard's saga. Digging up the past always left him feeling uneasy and bitter. They had been rich and famous warriors that people still adored, despite being dead for 10 years. As the only survivor, he'd come home to a fanfare, but little else for his efforts. There'd been no reward, no riches, not even reprieve from his taxes. I don't think that's a good idea, said Kel, not wanting to indulge Nadia's curiosity. More heads were turning in his direction, and now 3 merchants were standing beside his table. The other 2 were a local apprentice and another Corvanese with only 2 ribbons. Please, we just want the real story. We've heard it from the bards, but they always embellish it. More people were taking note of their conversation. Without being asked, Nadia sat down, and before Kel could protest, her 2 friends followed suit. One placed a mug of beer in front of him. We just want the truth, said the apprentice. People went back to their own business, and Kel felt some of his nervous energy drain away. Kel shook his head. You don't want that. Nobody wanted the truth about what had happened. They all said it, but the truth was ugly. It was knotted web of grey decisions, not black and white. People wanted neat and simple, but life was a convoluted path of decisions that no one could predict. If he told Nadia that he'd been kicked out the army at 17 because he was tired of following orders, she'd tell him it was fate. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been at home to hear about the call to arms. When the weather changed, the dwellers beyond the frozen circle, the Frostrunner clans, sent an emissary south to meet with the 5 kings. There hadn't been such a conclave in hundreds of years. Normally, the clans had no reason to leave their homeland on the ice, but even they were struggling to survive. 10 years ago, the Frostrunners had been starving to death, along with everyone else. The 5 kings came to an agreement and called upon their best, the bravest and greatest warriors. Lobran One-Eye, Cardaeus the bold, Droshala the beautiful, Bronn the mighty, and others. A total of 11 heroes that everyone knew and loved. Kel, like every other teenager, had idolized them. How quickly that had changed. They might have been warriors with famous names, but they weren't heroes. After days in the saddle, they'd moaned about sore arses like everyone else. No one wanted to hear about that, or how their mighty leader, Cardaeus, had a bad belly and got a run of the shits for 3 days. Tell us about the heroes, said the apprentice, startling Kelm from his reverie. No, tell us about the ice lich. Did she really turn the weather sour? Was it worse than now? Said the other merchant. I don't want to talk about it, said Kel, sliding the untouched beer across the table. He didn't want to go back there in his mind. Kel was about to get up from the table when Nadia's question caught him by surprise. When were you most afraid? Anger flooded Kel's mind, and he sank back into his chair. According to the Medina saga, his worst moment had come when he'd battled the Ice Lich. The truth was far more shocking, and that part of the story hadn't made it into the bard's tale. Fine. I'll tell you the real story, said Kel. It was the day Bronn the Mighty collapsed.
And hearing that after I finished the book, I mean, you told me right there, but it just didn't sink in, because there's been times where we meet our unlikely or reluctant hero, I guess is what they call that trope, where he doesn't accept that he was a hero, and he definitely doesn't want to go do anything of the sort again.
No.
But I thought, oh, well, there's a little bit of background. We've got that out of the way. Now we're going to move forward. It wasn't until, and I have my own section here.
Go on.
When I finally figured out what was happening, was my other favorite character, Garen, who later joins Kel in his endeavor that you're going to read about in this story. The two continue to argue about Willow, but Garen wasn't really listening anymore. Instead, he looked up at the night sky, trying to find something of interest. Clusters of stars glittered above his head, whose names he vaguely remembered. As a young boy, his mother had told him stories of glorious heroes that had died while saving the world. Because of their bravery, the shepherd cast their bodies into the night sky, immortalizing their names with stars. Garen couldn't understand how he had ever believed such nonsense. The truth about heroes and people in general was proving to be a lot more complex than he realized. He now viewed everything he had been taught by his parents and school teachers with suspicion. Garen had only to look at Volley to realize not everything was simple. He mocked the bard and didn't think very much of him or his profession. But when the Hundarians had attacked them, it was the bard who placed himself between Garen and the enemy. Thankfully, none of the Hundarians had reached him, but that hadn't stopped Garen from being afraid. In contrast, Valley had been utterly calm and poised for a fight that never came. As soon as it was over, the bard's first question was to ask if Garen was injured. Several times a day, Garen was made aware of how little he knew about the real world, and that up to now, his life had been sheltered. He was beginning to trust his instincts over what he had been told and what he had seen with his own eyes. That's where it clicked for me. That section right there is where the light bulb went off as to what was actually taking place. Yes, we have this great fantasy story. We have this quest. We have this wonderful magic and all of these creatures that they meet along the way and what's happening, and the characters that we're going to have in here with Kel. Phenomenal, and each one has a great story, and that's where I started paying attention. It clicked for me. I knew what Garen's purpose was in relation to Kel, and that I started looking and actually paying attention to the characters, their motivations, what they were thinking, what they were doing, and it just absolutely changed my reading experience. And to me, that was the magic of the story right there. It was just absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. I'm glad it worked for you.
There you have it. The reason, the inspiration behind the writing of The Quest for Heroes duology by Stephen Aryan. If you're interested in reading more information about the Quest for Heroes duology or Stephen Aryan's previous two trilogies, I'm going to have Stephen's website linked below, where you can find him on Twitter as well as his YouTube channel. He shares advice when it comes to writing, when it comes to publishing traditionally, tips and tricks for fantasy world building, and he does a lot of author interviews, which I have really enjoyed myself. All of that will be linked in the description box below. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Stephen Aryan why he wrote this series and reading a section of the story that meant a lot to him as an author. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.